why it's so frustrating when people who don't read the Bible start ripping on the Bible about this stuff. Like really, people who have never read more than the couple of verses out of context that Richard Dawkins quotes in his books, right? Where it's like they don't bother to read the part where God specifically says, right, you have a choice here between life and death, choose life, right? These areas of agency, these areas of, you're supposed to, the idea that the word is, I'm more familiar with the Old Testament, obviously, for obvious reasons, but the area where it says that it's not in heaven, right? It's here. It's for you to understand. Right? This idea is rooted in biblical thought, which is why, at least in Judaic thought, we have volume upon volume of people arguing with each other about how to interpret this stuff. Because my view of religion is that God gave a revelation, but he gave it to human beings who were capable of reason for a reason. He gave it to us because our job is to try and understand what the hell God was saying to us. And if we don't do that, then it's just as bad as no revelation at all. Revelation is given to a specific set of people at a specific set of time with knowledge of how people operate. God knows all of that stuff. And so the way that I sort of see the Bible, the way I see religion, is that we are a set of chemicals, and God puts the catalyst in the brew. And once the catalyst is in the brew, then things start building.
Almost as though he formed us and then breathed life into us.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I see where you're going with that.
Weirdly like
well,
that.
Which I mean, even in the language of the original Hebrew language, right? When it's talking about God breathing ruach into people, ruach is wind and spirit, right? So that the idea is that it is that life force that gives it that's what makes us unique. Right, it's that life force that makes us unique, as opposed to the animals, and that comes along with certain privileges and certain responsibilities.
And one of our favorite books, Poetic Diction, talks about the fact that when they originally used those words, it wasn't two meanings.
Right.
It was the meaning. It was breath and spirit, which is a wonderful idea, because it actually does takes you to where you got to be. I mean, that's the thing that civilization loses.
The image of the Trinity that you get from Genesis is Christ is the Word, God the Father calls forth the word, and his breath is the ruach, is the spirit. And the Catholic Thomistic understanding is that the Holy Spirit is the bond of love between the Father and the Son. You get this perfect picture of this logical universe, because God is the logic of the universe. And from that you get the natural law, and you get the natural rights that are enshrined in the political document that started the country.
And I can't think of another religion. I'm probably going to make a fool of myself here, but I've read most of the holy books, and I can't think of another religion that puts so much emphasis on the word, that God said, let there be light, and there was light, and
Pastafarianism. That's the one. But other than that one, the worship of pasta. That's my religion.
I'm not familiar with this delicious religion, but I would like to learn more.
It sounds good, doesn't it? Yeah,
but that's why, like, our country is based on words. This is why when you see people, it's the idea that human existence is based on words, right? That what matters most in our lives is based on words. Yeah. And then what the left says is, no, you're based on material. You're based on things. Words don't mean anything. And all the shortcomings in your life, this is based on lack of material privilege. What gives your life meaning is the words. Whether it's you saying, I love you to your spouse, or whether it is the words that came down from Sinai. It's words in our interactions with each other and our interactions with something beyond ourselves that actually matters.
Even predating Christianity, though, the Egyptians believed that words had magic and that the spoken word created something in the universe. This is why they built giant temples to themselves after they died, because they believed that you died a second time when people stopped speaking your name aloud. There is power in the spoken word, because it communicates the ideas in which humans find their meaning.
Somebody left.
Speaking of mythology.
Speaking of mythology, it is now time to welcome our very special guest. He is a clinical psychologist, a professor, and author of the best-selling 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. Even more interestingly, given tonight's subject matter, he hails from a nation, not America, located, as best I can recall, somewhere to the general north of us, a land whose chief exports are comedians and healthcare refugees, a land best known as George Washington's greatest mistake. Yes, I am talking about Canada. Please welcome Dr. Jordan Peterson.
Welcome.
That's a hell of an introduction. So you guys got all warmed up?
Dr. Peterson, we're talking about human freedom. Have you ever considered that if George Washington had just marched north, Americans would have invented Tim Hortons, and you wouldn't have to put your Lady King oppressor on your coinage to this very day?
No, you guys tried that in 1812 and got stomped pretty bad for it. I think we burned down the White House, if I remember correctly.
President Trump will take his revenge.
Yeah. That's fair. Welcome. Thank you for sitting down with us.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
We're talking about just random crap that matters to us. It started talking about human freedom.
And now we're talking religion, actually.
And now we're talking religion.
Yes, well, I heard you making some comments about Egyptian theology. when I just sat down. And so
You know far more than any of us on
well,
these
it is the
topics.
case that the Egyptians had an idea that the world was created as a consequence of the use of language, the word, right? And so the Judeo-Christian doctrine of the word seems to have some of its historical grounding in the ancient Egyptian conceptions. And the Egyptians were actually concerned not only with language, like the Mesopotamians, by the way, because their god Marduk, who conquered chaos to generate the world out of the pieces of chaos. It was chaos in monstrous form of another goddess named Tiamat. He used magic words to defeat her, and also attention. He was a god of attention. He had eyes all the way around his head. So both the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians were very much concerned not only with linguistic ability, but also with the capacity to pay attention, which I think is extremely interesting because it's different than thinking. It's something different than reason as well, because attention precedes reason. And attention is actually something that's also dependent on the structure of your values. And so the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians had figured out that it was something like the combination of attention and language that generated the habitable world. It's a really deep idea. I've kind of tracked that through the Old Testament too, and one of the things that I found absolutely fascinating about the opening sentence of Genesis is there's an idea that God uses language, logos, fundamentally, to extract out habitable order from chaos and potential. That's the basic idea. Then, of course, every time he does that, day by day, so to speak, he says that it's good. And so there's a really profound idea in there, an unbelievably profound idea, which is that not only does linguistic ability and the word transform chaos and potential into habitable order, but if it's truthful speech, then the habitable order that emerges is good. It's an ethical axiom. You were talking about axioms a little bit earlier. And so the axiom, the fundamental axiom that opens up the Old Testament is something like the being that's brought into being as a consequence of truthful speech is by definition good. It's an axiomatic statement, and it's so interesting, and it's such a brilliant, it's an absolutely brilliant idea, because
it's kind of what you believe when you have faith, is that you believe that creation is good, which is against all odds and against even what you can see with your eyes and suffer with your
well, then
flesh.
there's also a manner of participating in it that's good.
Well,
That's the thing that's so
true.
interesting, and that's your ethical obligation. And it's also something that's
Which,
like
by the way, precedes the exile, right? Everybody thinks that tilling the land, right, that our obligation to work happens after the exile from Eden. The first obligation of man is to cultivate and till the garden before they leave the garden. So the question is, why are they cultivating and tilling the garden when the garden is perfect, supposedly?
Well, it's also before that the statement is made that they're made in the image of God. It's not obvious what that means at that point. But if God, at least in part, the way that's laid out, is the structure that uses linguistic communication to give rise to being, that's the basic narrative, then the fact that people are made in that image is the idea that we continue that process.
Which is why they start naming the animals, right?
Right, that's exactly
The
right.
first action of man is to start using his own language.
Yeah, the animals don't exist in some sense till they're named. You know, just like things don't exist in some sense till they're named. Like, I mean, it's complicated.
In Jewish theology, it's the same thing, by the way, is that you're actually not supposed to name the baby until the Brit Day, until there's a Brit Milah. So with our son, we didn't name him formally until the day of his Brit Milah, because the idea is that he has not been fully invested almost as, like, he's a human being, but he hasn't been fully invested as a capable human being in a certain sense until we actually name him on the day that he is entered into the covenant. Once he enters into the covenant, then that's when you give him the name. Like, you literally do it simultaneous with that.
Well, words do call things into reality, you know, in some sense that we don't really understand. Otherwise, we wouldn't think, because what you're doing when you're thinking is it's the precursor in some sense to transforming potential into actuality. So one of the ways that I've been, and this is an alternative to thinking in a deterministic way, is that what we see in front of us is a landscape of possibility. That's what we face. And and we have a range of choices within that landscape of possibility. They're not unbounded because we're not omniscient or omnipotent, right? So they're not unbounded, but it's a wide range of choices. And we determine which of those potentialities will manifest themselves will manifest themselves in reality. And we do that, first of all, by thinking, because that helps us plot our course. We do that with words.
We think with words.
That's right.
Well, that's right. We think with
Charles
words.
Krauthammer talks about this, actually. Another clinical psychologist. He said that he learned
Psychiatrist.
Psychiatrist, that's right.
They're almost as good. a little druggy for my taste.
That's true. He's very
Nowadays,
useful, you know.
yeah.
But he said this early on in punditry. He realized that by naming something, he imbued his piece with great power. So as a psychiatrist, he identified some disorder, and this was a disorder that people had known about, you know, but he gave a name to it. And now every year, a dozen people are diagnosed with this disorder. And famously, in the 80s, he diagnosed the Reagan doctrine. And there was a little advocacy here, too. He was observing some things, but he also wanted to push the White House in that direction. And he said by giving the name, the Reagan doctrine, he, in a sense, created the Reagan doctrine.
I made a trip down to Costa Rica with some friends, probably 12 years ago now. And, you know, we're all looking at the things that we're going to do, go zip lining or go whitewater rafting. I somehow found a book about the exotic birds of Costa Rica. And, you know, you're on a long bus ride, so I'm thumbing through this book and learning the names of certain birds. As a result, I saw all of the birds while we were on the trip. No one else saw any of the birds. I would ask them, you know, did you see this? Did you see that?
Yeah,
they didn't.
There's an aspect of, and that goes along with that issue of attention. There's an aspect that's something like a bringing into focus, right? And it's a definition of what's there and what's not there at the same time. But and so obviously, in some sense, the birds were there, although they weren't there for you. But they blended into everything else. And that which blends into everything else is not really there in some sense. It's not there till it stands out against the background. So there is the background, whatever that is. Well, that's that potential in some sense. But it doesn't attain its full reality until it's carved out of the background.
But all of my friends apparently read books on how to sleep with beautiful women. Oh, yeah. Their experience in Costa Rica was much different.
Well, you got the birds.
But this is why inherited wisdom matters so much, because if you don't have inherited wisdom, you don't even know what you're looking for. Right, this is that famous psychological study where they have the person they have two people in the foreground who are throwing a basketball to one another, okay, and they say, you know, how many times is this person throwing the basketball to this other person, and then in the background they actually have a person dressed in a gorilla suit walking around like for a solid 10, 15 seconds,
it's right
in front, right,
yeah,
and they asked people
chest.
how many times, if you were keeping track of how many times the ball was thrown, then you knew how many times the ball was thrown. They would say, well, what about the gorilla? And people are like, well, what gorilla? But as soon as you tell people there was a gorilla in the video, they know there was a gorilla.
Yes, well, so one of the things that I've been discussing with the people that I've been talking to on this tour, the people in the audience, is the fact that this is something that's absolutely beyond belief, that neuroscience has converged on this as an idea, and it's partly as a consequence of these studies, although there's way more information than that's pushing this vision. Not only do you carve out what's real as a consequence of your words, but you see the world through your value system. And it's like, well, no, the world's there without your value system. It's like, no, you don't get it. Is the things that announce themselves to your perception. So the things that announce themselves to you as even more fundamental than facts, right? Because I think objects are even more fundamental than facts, is conditioned to a degree that's almost inexpressible by your value system. And one of the propositions that I've been putting forward to my audience is, look, if the world isn't manifesting itself to you in a manner that you find tolerable, and so you're bitter and resentful about that, and maybe you have your reasons to be that because life is very difficult, it's possible that you're aiming at the wrong things. It's like it's a presupposition that's worth investigating, because it does seem that you carve out figure from ground as a consequence of imposing a value system on this plethora, the infinite plethora of potential facts. And so if all that's doing is leading you to a position that isn't commensurate with the sort of life that you'd even like to bear, then you think, maybe my value system is not oriented properly. One of the things that's really interesting about the Old Testament, one of the things that makes it such a stupendous moral document, is that every time the ancient Hebrews, they get flattened by God all the time. Like, it's just, they build up an empire and they get flattened, and they build up an empire and they get flattened. And you know, it's often because there's a prophet emerges and says, you guys have deviated from the divine path, and so you're going to get walloped, and no one listens, or sometimes they do, and then they get walloped. But one of the things that really marks out the ancient Hebrews is every time they get walloped, they say, we must have made a mistake. Right? There's no victimization culture there, so to speak. It's like, if we're being flattened, it's because we're stupid and wrong. And you think, well, is that a pessimistic or an optimistic statement? It's like, well, if you're stupid and wrong, you might be able to do something about it. Right. But if the world's stupid and wrong...
But it's interesting. This is exactly the point that so many of the new scientific pro-Enlightenment writers find almost comical. One of them compared it to Monty Python, that they should find a proof of God in their disasters. That instead of, but in fact, it's an incredibly useful idea that it's your mistake. It's not God's mistake. It's your mistake.
Well, it's an
and what
open
is
question, anyways.
Yeah,
Right? It's
that
like,
is to
it's
be
like
asked,
you
yeah.
say, well, look, like the world is predicated on suffering, and it's got an overlay of malevolence. It's like there's no doubt about that.
Sure.
And so then the question is, well, where's the fault? And the answer to that is, well, you can't figure it out until you rectify your own faults.
But what does the prophet always do? He points them back to the words.
Right.
He points them back to those original ideas. And I think that, you know, to sort of pull this back to our 4th of July and also Canada Day.
Wherever that is.
And our Canada Day conversation is, you know, what is special about the words on which this nation and maybe to a broader extent the West as we understand it. What are the words? What are the ideas that brought us here? How can we help point people back to those ideas for their own, for selfish interest, obviously, because I think our world is a better place, but for their interest too.